10 years ago today, a new, intriguing incarnation of Sherlock Holmes was introduced to the world on BBC One, igniting public interest in the adventures of Holmes and Watson in a fresh package. And today, we're continuing our year-long 10th anniversary celebration by looking back on the time where Sherlock returned once again to examine those interesting little problems which the complex life of London so plentifully presents. Hello everybody, I'm KC, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. Both Sherlock Holmes and the series he carries rise from the grave after a long time away to be met by many people anticipating and demanding answers in The Empty Hearse. When London faces the threat of an imminent terrorist attack, Sherlock must return to his old life while realizing and trying to reconcile with just how much has changed since he left 2 years ago. Before we get into the episode itself, let's talk about where we left the show. Sherlock's fall from the roof of Bart's was a huge point of speculation and discussion. I don't think I can overemphasize just how many elaborate theories there were and how much people were begging to know how the hell he survived. Not only did they give people a massive cliffhanger and mystery, but then they give them 2 years to stew over it because the stars of the show had to go and get careers. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that The Empty Hearse was the most hyped up episode in the entire series, getting an astonishing 12 million viewers when it premiered in the UK, the highest viewing figures in the show's history. Even I was off to YouTube on New Year's Day in 2014 praying that someone had managed to get the episode up so I could see how he did it without having to wait the torturous 3-week gap between the US and UK airings. That might be the shortest gap between countries yet, but I couldn't wait, guys. I had to know. But as is the paradoxical nature of fan engagement, there's a certain amount of expectations that comes with that, with some people going into this episode with an attitude somewhat like this.
I'm hoping all this aligns exactly with my fanfic. If not, I will be very disappointed.
So of course the episode wastes no time in giving us the answers we seek. I'm going to take a moment to recreate my reaction to the first couple of minutes of The Empty Hearse. Ahem. Okay, so someone's dragging Moriarty away. Probably Mycroft's people. That makes sense. Wait, what are they doing? What? You've gotta be... What? A mask? And Sherlock's on a bungee cord now? Huh? Window smashing, Molly kissing Darren Brown. What? That's it? That's the answer? This is ridiculous. This is absurd. This is... bollocks. Oh, thank Arceus. This sequence had me really worried, but I cannot tell you how relieved I was when Lestrade interrupted this absolutely preposterous explanation. Looking back on it, it's funny to see just how absurd they tried to make it, and framing it as someone just trying to come up with an elaborate theory for how Sherlock could have survived. That someone being Anderson, who has certainly changed. Is it weird I kind of prefer him like this? I think Jonathan Ayres had a lot of fun with this shift in Anderson's character. To me, this approach really captured the air of deep speculation at the time, and having it become a recurring joke in the episode to have others theorize about how he did it, while making us wait until almost the end of the episode for the actual answer, and having the ideas continue to be exaggerations of things that I wouldn't be surprised if some people came up with. I know some people found this insulting to the fans and theorists, but really, I thought it was all in good fun. I don't think any of it was mean-spirited. It was really just poking fun at the practical subculture that had developed over a discussion that was so large it leaked into the show itself. Tell me none of this exists out there, then we'll talk. All of this will eventually lead us to the true explanation, but there's quite a bit of episode to go over before we get to that. The Empty Hearse is mostly dedicated to Sherlock returning to London after 2 years away, where he spent his time dismantling Moriarty's criminal network. Seems like a more productive use of time than his book counterpart, who just traveled around until the only person who knew he was alive made a mistake. Though part of me wishes we got to know a bit more about what exactly Sherlock got up to during his travels. There's certainly been wide speculation since, and we even get possible hints of his travels in the prequel short, Many Happy Returns, but I wish we heard a bit more about it. But that's barely a nitpick. And it's far from the only way this episode is different from the original story. In fact, I feel like The Empty Hearse is more of a direct reinvention of the story that inspired it, The Empty House, than any other episode of Sherlock. A lot of the same story beats happen, but it's the reactions from the characters and the overall attitude that is much different and, in my opinion, better. Now don't get me wrong, I love The Empty House. It's a really sweet reunion story, but I really like the approach this episode takes of John being furious with Sherlock about faking his death and not telling him. It's stuff like this that makes me think that deviation from the source material isn't inherently a bad thing, and doing it correctly is something I think Sherlock has mastered by this point. I find the sentiment that Moffat and Gatiss share, that Holmes kinda got away with putting Watson through a lot with this whole scheme of his, interesting and pretty valid. But John ain't having it, and you completely understand why he's so angry. He trusted Sherlock more than he probably has anyone else, and it's quite the betrayal for him to realize that he not only let John think he was dead, but didn't trust him enough to keep a secret when there were other people who knew. But of course, that doesn't mean John isn't willing to keep his secrets when asked.
Yes, it's still a secret. Promise you won't tell anyone. Swear to God!
I also love the presentation of Sherlock's attitude and ways of justifying his actions here. He's in this weird middle ground of trying to apologize and recognizing John's anger, but also in the area of thinking that as soon as he explains himself, it'll all make sense, because it was all for the sake of the case. I think this is best illustrated with the first moment they have together, after John's done threatening to strangle him, where Sherlock starts trying to explain how he faked his death, and John could care less. He doesn't want to know how, he wants to know why, which is kind of the approach of this story in a nutshell. It's not going to spend the next 90 minutes explaining how Sherlock did what he did, but the reaction to him coming back from the dead, especially from Sherlock's point of view. Expecting to just jump back into London as if nothing changed, only to discover just how much has. But before we get to the meat of that topic, let's take some time to go over the numerous references that return with Sherlock in our segment. As usual, there are quite a few callbacks to the story that inspired this one, The Empty House. Sherlock tries to surprise John with the reveal that he's alive by showing up in disguise. And really, with how good Cumberbatch is at impressions, I'm surprised Sherlock doesn't go the extra mile like this more often. This stunt later leads to John thinking a man at his clinic is also Sherlock in disguise, which is a fair assumption since this man resembles the old book salesman that Holmes was masquerading as upon his return in the original story. When Sherlock tries to explain how he survived at one point, he mentions that one of his potential methods was a form of Japanese wrestling, which was the method Holmes ultimately used at the Reichenbach Falls to send Moriarty to his watery demise. Sherlock also mentions that Lestrade had been letting things slide while he was away, which is very close to the first thing Holmes said to the inspector when he returned. As Sherlock is getting back to work, he describes London as a great cesspool, much like Watson does at the beginning of A Study in Scarlet. At one point, Sherlock and Mycroft pass the time by trying to compete in deduction, is the best way I can put it, which is similar to the way they converse with each other when Mycroft was first introduced in The Greek Interpreter. And they spend this time gathering deductions from a hat with very similar conclusions as a hat from The Blue Carbuncle. I see we're repeating references here. One of the clients who comes to Baker Street has a similar problem as the client in the story A Case of Identity, and during a different meeting, Sherlock briefly mentions Professor Presbyteri's monkey glands, which is a callback to the very bizarre story, The Creeping Man. If you have the time, give that one a read. It's a weird one. While at work, John mentions someone named Dr. Werner, which is the name of the man Watson sold his practice to in The Norwood Builder after Holmes returned and he moved back into Baker Street, because the status quo is God was not invented by sitcoms. Oh, and remember that sentiment John expressed at Sherlock's grave from The Final Problem? Well, it's back again. And this time they made sure to include the word wisest in there.
You were the best and the wisest man that I have ever known.
Mycroft briefly brings up someone Sherlock encountered while he was away by the name of Baron Mopterus. Fitting, since that was a throwaway line about an old case in the Reigate puzzle. Watson frequently mentioned cases that he never wrote for one reason or another. There were a bunch of these. You could make a whole collection just on these unwritten cases. And people probably have. There's a lot of post-Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories out there. For more obvious callbacks, there's of course John's mustache, the most distinct feature of his book counterpart that it actually took me a while to get used to him not having it on the show. And having seen it now, I get it. I mean, it's fine, but one of the running gags of this episode is that no one likes it, and then it's gone by the half-hour mark. But I appreciate the attempt.
Don't shave for Sherlock Holmes.
You should put that on a t-shirt.
Just a second. Yep, that's what I thought. But we can't talk about book-related introductions in this episode without mentioning... Mary Morstan, played by Amanda Abington. You know what that was? The Sound of Discourse. Mary's inclusion in the series was met with mixed reactions. Is that the polite way to put it? Just in case you're unfamiliar, in The Sign of Four, Mary Morstan is introduced, Watson takes a liking to her, and by the end of that story, they're married, and remain so until after the final problem. I thought that was worth clarifying because a lot of adaptations don't really bring this up. Mary's been in adaptations before, but it's usually a one-off appearance when she does. I think before this, the only adaptation to go as far as them getting married were the Guy Ritchie movies, though feel free to correct me on that. But when she was introduced in Sherlock, it was controversial with shippers. Let's be blunt here. Maybe people had legitimate reasons for not liking Mary as a character, and I know there are shippers out there who don't mind her, but at the time, the big point of contention was that Mary was getting in the way of John Locke ever being canon, to the point that Abington was harassed and sent death threats over her role in the show. Look, you don't have to like Mary, that's perfectly fine, but can we please agree as an audience, as a society, that harassing an actor because of a fictional creative choice you didn't like is never, ever, ever okay?
Never, never, ever, ever, for never, ever?
Never, ever, never, never, ever, ever, never.
It's stuff like this that fostered my disdain for the very concept of shipping for years, and it took some of the nicest people I've ever met to change my mind on that. In summation, don't harass creatives because they're interfering with your ship. That's why we have fanfiction. So, unbelievable, but sadly not at all surprising controversy aside, how is Mary in this episode? Honestly, she's great. She fits in the dynamics of the show really well, and even the few scenes she has in her debut here is full of more personality and charm than even the original version. She has astounding chemistry with John that is just so endearing, though that could be because her and Freeman were husband and wife at the time. She's witty, clever, and she likes Sherlock. That's significant. Up to this point, the women in John's life have either had a vocal disdain for Sherlock or just kind of tolerated the guy. But this almost instant acceptance from Mary and even making an effort to help John come around makes it clear that even if you didn't know who Mary was before this, that she's going to be different from the other girls John has known. We'll definitely be talking more about Mary in future episodes, but this was, for me at least, a great introduction of things to come. I also really love the idea of bringing Mary in during the gap years. It's a great shorthand for emphasizing how much has changed, and just because Sherlock is back, that things aren't going to go back to exactly as they were before. A good chunk of this episode is focus on Sherlock working on a case while getting back into the swing of things and trying to find new ways to adjust to what's changed. Even if his reunion with John didn't go very well, everyone else worked out pretty smoothly. Lestrade's was my personal favorite. Getting the expected remark,
Ooh, you bastard.
and the unexpected gesture. It's funny, sweet, and really fits his character perfectly. Because John isn't willing to forgive him right away, Sherlock has to spend this portion of the episode with some other characters. And while we all want to see the Baker Street Boys make up, it's kind of cool to see these dynamics and relationships get more screen time. From him and Mycroft just lounging around at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson going back into doting mother mode almost instantly, and Sherlock even recruiting Molly to accompany him on cases. This is definitely an episode where the characters are more front and center, and the case, that being the impending terrorist attack, is more in the background for the first 2/3 of the episode, which is kind of a relief. After how intense the Reichenbach fall was, the Empty Hearse seems to be more focused on having some fun downtime with some intrigue and deduction work and the occasional action set piece sprinkled in to keep the pace fresh and interesting for the 90-minute runtime. It makes the events feel more like a comfortable return to settle back in after such a gut-wrenching departure. Sherlock even takes the time to express his gratitude to Molly for her help in the Reichenbach fall, which was so nice to see. A contribution that was essential and significant because as Moriarty was threatening all the people Sherlock cared about, he didn't account for Molly, which Sherlock not only used to his advantage, but used to show Molly just how important she is to him. I do kind of wish Moriarty got to know that the person who had led to him being outsmarted was someone he had used as a one-off pawn. The whole affair finally gave Molly the recognition she really deserved. She even got engaged during the 2-year gap, and appreciating appreciate how well Molly's being treated in this moment because, frankly, it's gonna go downhill from here. Oh, and one other thing.
Plans? Just my parents.
Come again.
Yeah, that was quite a curveball. If you don't know, Sherlock Holmes' family life is a real mystery. His life before university, or even which university he went to, is unknown, and we know virtually nothing about his parents. Holmes' past is so vague, it's kind of a miracle Mycroft exists at all. So the fact that this not only happened, but it's just a quick, nonchalant appearance is jaw-dropping to hardcore fans. I love the characterization of them too. It might not be what you would expect, but there's something really charming about it. And keeping up with the family casting angle, Sherlock's parents are played by Benedict Cumberbatch's actual parents. Speaking of the new, we've also got some fun new direction this time, with excellent editing that helps the episode flow smoothly and entertainingly. We have the return of the observation/deduction text on screen. There's a really nice sequence when Sherlock enters the restaurant to reunite with John, seeing him strategizing and deducing with almost rhythmic precision. The scene where John is trapped underneath a bonfire is eerie and almost claustrophobic, but the standout from a production standpoint is the use of transitions, and not really in the creative scene transition ways, but for more comedic effect. The timing of the cuts is perfect and makes so many moments absolutely hilarious. Oh, and Sherlock drives a motorcycle. Pretty cool, but I'm wondering just how much of a coincidence it is that they put this in less than a year after the Doctor acquired a very similar ride. Also, why is Mary showing him the text while he's driving? Just read them, that's dangerous. The editing also helps us keep track of Sherlock and John's separate lives while we anxiously wait for them to get back together. But eventually, the episode delivers, and I kinda love that as soon as John is back with Sherlock at Baker Street, he falls back into the investigation routine rather quickly, no matter how much he resisted up to this point. Anyway, now that we've got the boys back together, let's talk a bit about the case. This time around, there's nothing overly intricate about it, but it's still really creative and thrilling, and apparently was a vehicle for Mark Gatiss' obsession with the London Underground. By having the attack be a bomb planted under Parliament in an unused train station built into an abandoned train cart. A little over the top? Perhaps, but Mycroft's got a secret Kingsman-style office now, so we're dipping a bit more into the dramatic pool than we already were. I thought it was a cool idea. I was satisfied with the journey of getting to this point of conclusion, the adventure aspect of thwarting the attack, and it gave them a good way to include Sebastian Moran from the Empty House. Now, yes, Moran doesn't really do much in this story. He doesn't even get a line, but in terms of characterization and role in the story, it's fairly similar to his book counterpart. A respected man of high position with nefarious ties and ambitions and sneaky and distant methods to achieve his bloodstained work. Only major thing that's different is that he doesn't appear to work for Moriarty this time, which is a shame, but I can live with it. But there is one part of Moran's inclusion that I object to.
He's the big rat, rat number one.
Cop out! See, before Season 3 premiered, they released keywords that would refer to each new episode. They did this with Season 2 as well. Woman, hound, fall. The words for Season 3, however, were wedding, vow, and rat. The word rat only has one meaning to a Sherlock Holmes fan: the giant rat of Sumatra. Remember how I mentioned that Watson brings up a lot of cases he never chronicled? This is, without question, the most famous one. I assume because it was built up to be a case the world was not ready to hear about. And I feel like if there was any adaptation that could have given this infamous tale the scope it deserved, it was Sherlock. But instead, it boils down to a few loosely connected name drops. Lame. Another missed opportunity in my eyes is with the agent they keep mentioning gave his life to get them the information on the attack. We never find out his name, but I think they should have called him Adair, the man Moran murdered in the Empty House. It could have been another extra bit of fan service. Ah well, what potential was squandered there is made up for not just by the suspense of Sherlock and John working together again to track and disarm this bomb, but when we finally reach the moment where Sherlock explains how he faked his death. Now, I'm not that interested in breaking down the method that Sherlock used to survive the fall. The answer was satisfying to me overall and seemed to account for every vantage and disadvantage point both the audience and the characters had. I'm more interested in looking into why Sherlock did this the way he did and what it represents for him going forward. During the explanation, most of it revolves around what I was saying back in the Reichenbach Fall, but was much more elaborate and planned out than perceived then. With Mycroft's help, Sherlock sets out to take down Moriarty and and his network by working to be ahead of his game every step of the way. During that whole escapade, he knew that it would lead them to that rooftop, and he was ready to disappear and fake his death to take down this vast criminal network. It generates the same feeling that Sherlock usually does when on a case, going to any lengths necessary to solve it, which explains why Sherlock suddenly finds Moriarty's made-up computer code so important in the last third. He was keeping up appearances for John and leading him in a different direction so Sherlock could focus on the bigger picture. But there's one other important aspect of all this, why Sherlock truly had to fake his death. As I've said in previous reviews, saying Sherlock doesn't care about others just because he's not the best at showing it, or even seeing the true value in it for himself, is not that simple. And I think this plan, this jump, and this confrontation highlighted a transition period for him. Yes, Sherlock can be uncaring and cold when he feels it's in his own self-interest, but with this explanation of why he went to these lengths to take down Moriarty, we see that that's not the only factor. If Sherlock truly only cared about the cases and not the people around him, he could have just run off and started dismantling Moriarty's network once they had the information, which they did even before Moriarty struck at the Tower of London. Sherlock went to the trouble to fake his death so he could take down Moriarty's network without his friends coming to harm, trying to talk him out of it, or them getting involved at all. The case still came first at the cost of detachment from his life and friends. But I think once Sherlock returns, he's more open to admitting how much he values the people in his life and being more willing to acknowledge it, possibly due to truly being alone for the last 2 years. It's partly why I wish they mentioned his time away a bit more, because there's definitely a difference between pre- and post-fall Sherlock Holmes. A new attitude that the episode never really addresses, but portrays in several instances all throughout, offering for Molly to assist him on cases while expressing his gratitude and wishing her nothing but the best. His moments with Mycroft trying to nudge him in the direction of seeking companionship, which I thought was really interesting, and of course, his encounters with John. There's a great moment in the restaurant scene where Sherlock hesitates slightly as he sees John in person for the first time in 2 years. I can't quite tell you what's going through his mind in that moment, but it could be that Sherlock is, even for a moment, nervous about how John will react.
You know, it is just possible that you won't be welcome.
Still believing he did the right thing because now a massive criminal syndicate has been disbanded, but that he didn't factor in just how much this would upset John, shifting between waving John's reactions off as unnecessary and genuinely trying to apologize. So in the second act, Sherlock tries to move on since he thinks John is done, but he can't get him out of his head. So he goes to some questionable lengths to get John to forgive him. Yeah, trying to get John's forgiveness with the belief that they will be blown to bits any minute was a bit mean, but to be fair, life or death situations seem to be the best way these two have of bonding. It's unconventional, but it works. Plus, I think if he hadn't pulled the stunt in the middle of a case where John is reminded of why he's friends with this crazy genius in the first place, it probably wouldn't have worked. But like I said, as angry as he was and had a right to be, John gets back into the swing of things pretty quickly. And even if it was under false pretenses, we know from the end of the Reichenbach Fall that John meant everything he said, because he missed this. He missed the adventure. And he missed Sherlock. And even after 2 years apart, the teamwork and bickering are still as prevalent as ever. I know Sherlock Holmes is good at putting on a sympathetic act when he needs to. He did it through his oblivious moments in the Reichenbach Fall and in the train cart here. But I refuse to believe that this heart-wrenching goodbye wasn't genuine. As much as Sherlock has wanted to deem himself a
high-functioning sociopath,
that's just not true. And I think both the events of the Reichenbach Fall and the reunion in the Empty Hearse made him be more open to the ones he trusts and values most. It's hardly a full character arc, but it's character development that will be very prominent over the course of season 3. But back over to the Fall explanation real quick. The older I get, the more I find the reaction to Sherlock laying out how he did it really amusing. I think it's a fun bit of commentary on how hyping something up over a long period of time can lead to a sort of unfair dissatisfaction. I'm sure there were plenty of people out there like Anderson who weren't impressed by the answer or found fault with it, even very minute fault. Look, I spend most of my free time doing nerdy analysis videos on the internet, so maybe I'm not one to judge, but I have heard language like this over and over again that's nitpicky, but that's just the nature of things, and again, something that's kind of been around the Sherlock Holmes fandom since the original stories. We could go on for a while about that, and I almost started to when writing this, but this is getting long again, so I'm just gonna put that discussion to bed for now. Maybe another time though, because it's really interesting. In fact, to be fair, my only issue with the explanation has nothing to do with Sherlock, but Mycroft. There's a scene in the Reichenbach Fall where it's revealed that Mycroft shared personal information about Sherlock to Moriarty, so Moriarty would cooperate with them. I didn't bring this up last time because as we learn the true story here, it's clear that that was just part of the act. I was kind of disappointed by that because I liked this fault in Mycroft's actions, that he chose getting results for national security over protecting his brother. I'm easier on the choice now because there will be quite a few more times in the future where Mycroft will make substantial misjudgments, but still, if I had to give this resolution a criticism, that would be it. And Sherlock finally got to reveal all this to Anderson of all people. The episode jokes that he would be the last person Sherlock would tell all that to, which some have used to draw skepticism towards the solution, but really, I think that just brings home how much Sherlock really wants to explain how he did it, and at this point, Anderson seems to be the only one who cares. By the end, everything is wrapped up in a neat little bow, reuniting with the old and embracing the new. Sherlock even willingly wears the hat. And that is truly the most satisfying reunion of them all. Close second would be Sherlock in his coat. But Sherlock Holmes may be back and Moriarty may be gone, but as the episode ends, we find that another suspicious and even more dangerous figure is watching them. Overall, the Empty Hearse was a more chill but very welcome return to the series. Aside from maybe a scandal in Belgravia, this is the first episode where the conflict and development of the characters is more front and center and the investigation stuff is secondary. Which I get is not what some people are here for, but for me, seeing how Sherlock tackled, reinterpreted, and expanded on these iconic characters is the biggest reason I tuned into the show. So it was such a delight that after such a long time away, to get to take some time to indulge in that some more while not completely forgetting the casework. There's enough mystery and intrigue and general deduction work to keep the tone of the show consistent while shifting the focus slightly. But despite the more low-key approach, there was a lot to tackle in this episode, especially given the nature of it not only being an episode right after the series' greatest and most talked about cliffhanger, but something of a time skip that dealt with several things connected to that. It's packed with great and varied story beats and tons of subtle character moments that say so much about them in such little time. There are so many great little details in this episode that I didn't even get to all of them. Mycroft complaining about having to do legwork, my headcanon that Lestrade led the police investigation that cleared Sherlock's name, Martin Freeman's continued priceless reactions, How I Did It by Jack the Ripper, the list goes on. The performances are just as lively and nuanced as ever. The story is a joy to follow along with. The time they took to wrap up loose ends from the Reichenbach Fall was overly satisfying, with one or two faults depending on who you ask, and I personally found the jabs at fan and theory culture appropriately satirical. It's not perfect, I do have my issues with it, but it's also a very rewatchable one for me. It's one of those episodes that I could talk about for a while, as you can clearly see, because even if it's not one of the more exciting or intricate adventures in the series, it has a lot going for it, and highlights quite a few things that I think makes Sherlock special. The Empty Hearse was certainly a turning point for the series that I was anxious to see unfold at the time, and we'll see just how much more things will change in The Sign of 3. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.